In the idyllic village of St. Mary Mead, a lavish garden party at Ashford Manor turns deadly when a guest collapses by a sparkling marble fountain poisoned by cyanide. Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet knitting, unravels a web of secrets, ambition, grudges, and hidden debts. Was it the ruthless rival, Victor Crane, driven by greed? The bitter gardener, Tom Baines, nursing a vendetta? Or the desperate caterer, Mrs. Morton, fearing ruin? As whispers swirl and clues emerge, Miss Marple's sharp mind reveals the truth behind the poisoned fountain, proving no secret is safe in this tranquil village. Chapter 1. The Invitation. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with the predictability of a well-wound clock, Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles moving with the gentle rhythm of a metronome. The late summer light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak table where a single letter lay, its cream envelope embossed with the crest of Ashford Manor. The invitation, penned in Sir Henry Ashford's bold hand, announced a garden party to celebrate the unveiling of his prized Italian fountain, a marvel of marble and craftsmanship recently shipped from Florence. The event promised music, fine fare, and the company of the county's most notable residents. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly as she read the flourished script. Such gatherings, she knew, were seldom as simple as they seemed. St. Mary Mead, though quaint, was no stranger to undercurrents. Sir Henry, a widowed industrialist whose fortune came from steel and ambition, had settled at Ashford Manor 2 years prior, his wealth stirring both admiration and envy. His parties were lavish, his hospitality generous, but whispers followed him like shadows. Miss Marple, with her keen ear for village gossip, had heard murmurs at the post office and the Women's Institute. Sir Henry's latest venture, a contract for a new railway line, had pitted him against Mr. Victor Crane, a rival whose sharp suits and sharper tongue were well known in London circles. The two had clashed publicly at the Red Lion Inn, their voices carrying over pints of ale. Crane, it was said, never forgot a slight. Then there was Tom Baines, the manor's gardener, a man of few words but many grudges. His brother, dismissed from Sir Henry's employ for reasons unclear, had left the village in disgrace. Baines's sullen demeanor at the market, his hands always buried in his pockets, suggested a bitterness that lingered like damp in the bones. Miss Marple, watching him once as he pruned the vicarage roses, noted the tightness in his jaw, the kind she'd seen in a young man years ago who'd burned a rival's barn out of spite. The caterer, Mrs. Eliza Morton, was another thread in the village tapestry. Her bustling shop in the high street supplied scones and tarts to every notable event, but her smile, Miss Marple observed, was strained of late. At the church fete, Mrs. Bantry had whispered that Mrs. Morton owed Sir Henry a substantial sum, a debt he might call in if her business faltered. Miss Marple, sipping tea at the time, had nodded thoughtfully. Money, she knew, could turn even the kindest heart to cunning. The invitation, now resting beside her teacup, held more than words. It was a summons to a stage where human nature would play its familiar roles: envy, pride, perhaps even malice. Miss Marple's fingers paused, the wool soft against her skin. She recalled a garden party in her youth, where a stolen glance had led to a stolen life. People, she thought, were much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or the grandest city. Their secrets bloomed like weeds, hidden until a careful hand plucked them out. She rose, smoothing her lavender skirt, and placed the invitation in her knitting basket, where it nestled among skeins of pale blue wool. The garden party was tomorrow, and she would attend, her eyes as sharp as her needles. Sir Henry's fountain, she mused, might draw more than admiration. Water, after all, could conceal as much as it revealed. With a final glance at the drowsy village street, where a blackbird sang and a bicycle bell chimed, Miss Marple turned to her evening. There was work to be done, and she would be ready. Chapter 2. The Garden Party. The sun hung high over Ashford Manor, its golden rays gilding the sprawling gardens where St. Mary Mead's finest had gathered. The air was thick with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, and the hum of conversation mingled with the soft strains of a string quartet tucked beneath a striped marquee. Sir Henry Ashford's garden party was a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and taste. At the heart of the lawn stood the Italian fountain, its marble cherubs glistening as water arced from their stone lips into a wide basin below. Guests drifted toward it, drawn by its elegance, their murmurs of admiration rising like the bubbles in their champagne flutes. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair beneath a sycamore's shade, observed the scene with her usual quiet attention, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. The manor's grounds were a triumph of order and beauty. Hedges trimmed to geometric precision framed beds of lavender and peonies, while gravel paths wound past statues of nymphs and satyrs. Sir Henry, resplendent in a cream suit, moved among his guests with a practiced smile, though Miss Marple noted a faint tension in his posture, as if he carried an unseen weight. His broad shoulders and silvering hair made him a commanding figure, but his eyes flicked too often toward the fountain, as if it held more than water. She wondered if he sensed the undercurrents swirling beneath the party's polished surface. Near the buffet, Mrs. Eliza Morton, the caterer, directed her staff with a brisk efficiency that belied the strain in her face. Her dark hair was pinned tightly, and her apron, starched to perfection, bore the faintest trace of a stain. Odd, Miss Marple thought, for a woman so meticulous. Mrs. Morton's trays of cucumber sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and delicate pastries were the talk of the village. But her quick glances toward Sir Henry suggested more than professional pride. Miss Marple recalled the whispers of Mrs. Morton's debts, a shadow cast by Sir Henry's financial hold over her. A woman in such straits, she mused, might act rashly to protect her livelihood. Across the lawn, Tom Baines, the gardener, lingered near a hedge, his rough hands clasped behind his back. His tweed cap was pulled low, and his boots, curiously clean for a man who spent his days in soil, gleamed in the sunlight. Miss Marple had seen him earlier, tending a rose bush with a fierceness that seemed more personal than professional. His brother's dismissal from Ashford Manor had left a wound, one that festered in the village's collective memory. Baines's eyes, dark and unreadable, followed Sir Henry's movements, and Miss Marple wondered if his resentment extended beyond his employer to the guests who now trampled his carefully tended lawns. Victor Crane, Sir Henry's rival, stood out like a hawk among doves. His tailored navy suit and polished brogues marked him as a man who belonged in boardrooms, not village fetes. He stood near the fountain, a glass of lemonade in hand, his smile as sharp as a blade. Crane's rivalry with Sir Henry was no secret, but Miss Marple had heard of another feud. At the Red Lion Inn, he'd argued heatedly with Mr. Reginald Holt, a young entrepreneur whose innovative designs had recently won a lucrative contract. Holt, now laughing with a group of investors, seemed oblivious to Crane's scrutiny. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched Crane adjust his cufflinks, a nervous gesture that betrayed his polished exterior. She had known men like him in St. Mary Mead, charming until crossed, dangerous when cornered. The guests, a mix of local gentry and city acquaintances, moved in a dance of etiquette and ambition. Mrs. Bantry, in a floral dress and wide-brimmed hat, held court near the marquee, her laughter ringing out as she recounted a tale of her latest charity bazaar. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, sipped sherry and discussed cricket with the vicar, his medical bag tucked discreetly by his chair. Young women in pastel frocks flirted with eligible bachelors, while older matrons exchanged gossip over teacups. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, absorbed it all. She had attended many such gatherings, and she knew the surface gaiety often masked deeper tensions. People, she thought, revealed themselves most when they believed no one was watching. As the afternoon wore on, the heat grew heavy, and guests sought refreshment. The fountain, with its promise of cool water, became a focal point. A footman stood nearby, offering crystal glasses filled from the basin. The water, sparkling in the sunlight. Miss Marple watched as Reginald Holt, his face flushed with warmth and conversation, approached the fountain. He accepted a glass, drank deeply, and returned to his group, his laughter carrying across the lawn. She noted the ease of his movements, the confidence of a man on the cusp of success. Yet something in his manner, a quick glance toward Crane, suggested unease. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting. A premonition, faint but insistent, stirred within her. The quartet struck up a lively waltz, and couples took to the lawn, their steps light on the grass. Sir Henry, ever the host, escorted a dowager in lavender silk, his charm masking the strain Miss Marple had glimpsed earlier. Mrs. Morton, now stationed near a table of petits fours, adjusted a tray with unnecessary care, her eyes darting to the fountain. Baines had vanished into the shrubbery, though Miss Marple caught a glimpse of his cap near the greenhouse. Crane remained by the fountain, his posture casual, but his gaze fixed on Holt. The scene, so picturesque, felt to Miss Marple like a painting with a flaw, a crack hidden beneath the varnish. Then came the scream. It was sharp, piercing, cutting through the music and chatter like a blade. Heads turned, glasses paused mid-sip, and the quartet faltered. A young woman in a yellow dress pointed toward the fountain, her face pale. There, on the gravel path, lay Reginald Holt, his body crumpled like a discarded marionette. His glass had fallen, its contents seeping into the earth, and his face, once animated, was now a ghastly mask of gray. His eyes stared blankly at the sky, and a faint froth clung to his lips. The crowd surged forward, then recoiled, a collective gasp rising like a wave. Dr. Haydock pushed through, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Holt, his fingers seeking a pulse, his expression grim. "He's gone," he said, his voice low but carrying in the sudden silence. He leaned closer, sniffing the air near Holt's mouth, then glanced at the spilled glass. "Poison," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. "Cyanide, if I'm not mistaken." The word hung in the air, heavy as the heat. Guests whispered, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. Sir Henry, approaching swiftly, froze at the doctor's words, his hand gripping his cane. Mrs. Morton, nearby, dropped a tray, the clatter of china jarring the stillness. Baines emerged from the shrubbery, his face unreadable, while Crane stepped back, his cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted them once more. Miss Marple's needles stilled entirely. She rose, her lavender shawl slipping slightly, and moved closer, her steps slow but deliberate. The fountain, its water still sparkling, seemed to mock the tragedy at its base. She noted the footman, now pale and stammering, insisting he'd filled Holt's glass directly from the basin. The crowd parted for her, as they often did, mistaking her frail appearance for insignificance. But her eyes, sharp as ever, took in every detail, the faint tremor in Sir Henry's hand, the way Mrs. Morton's fingers twisted in her apron, Baines's 2 clean boots, and Crane's calculated step backward, as if distancing himself from the scene. Inspector Craddock would arrive soon, she knew, with his notebook and his questions. But Miss Marple needed no official summons to begin her work. She had seen death before, in St. Mary Mead, in London, in the quiet corners where human nature laid itself bare. Poison, she thought, was a coward's weapon, intimate yet detached. It required access, opportunity, and a heart cold enough to watch a man die. She glanced at the suspects, each a thread in the tapestry of motive and means. Sir Henry, whose fountain was now a murder weapon, had he misjudged an enemy? Mrs. Morton, her livelihood at stake. Could desperation have driven her to such an act? Baines, nursing a grudge. Did his anger extend to Holt, a guest who symbolized his employer's world? And Crane, whose rivalry with Holt was fresh and raw, had he seen the fountain as a tool for revenge? The crowd buzzed, voices rising in speculation. "The water," someone whispered. "It must be the fountain." Another voice countered, "But we all drank from it." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The fountain was indeed the key, its public nature both a puzzle and a clue. Poisoning a shared source risked others, yet only Holt had fallen. The precision of the act suggested intent, not accident. She recalled a case in the village years ago, where a poisoned teapot had claimed a single victim amid a crowded room. The trick, she had learned, was in the timing and the delivery. As the guests were herded toward the marquee, away from the body, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the fountain's marble edge. The cherubs, frozen in their playful dance, seemed to watch her in return. She noted the basin's depth, the pipes hidden beneath its ornate base. A small access panel, barely visible, caught her eye. It was a detail most would overlook, but Miss Marple was not most people. She had known a groundskeeper once, in St. Mary Mead, who'd hidden stolen silver in a garden statue's base. Such places, she thought, were perfect for secrets. Sir Henry, now speaking with Doctor. Haydock looked shaken, his earlier poise unraveling. "The fountain was checked this morning," he insisted, his voice carrying. "The water comes from a private spring. Pure, I swear it." Miss Marple tilted her head. His vehemence was telling, but whether it spoke of innocence or guilt, she could not yet say. Mrs. Morton, gathering her scattered trays, avoided the fountain, her movements jerky. Baines, standing apart, stared at the ground, his cap shadowing his eyes. Crane, now joined by a business associate, spoke in low tones, his earlier unease replaced by a calculated calm. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from the wool in her hands. The garden party, with its laughter and elegance, had become a stage for murder. She thought of the village, its quiet streets hiding passions as fierce as any city's. People, she reflected, were predictable in their unpredictability. Greed, envy, fear. These were the currents that flowed beneath the surface, and the fountain had brought them to light. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, each stitch a step toward the truth. The puzzle was before her, its pieces scattered but within reach. She would find them, as she always did, in the small things, the glance, the gesture, the stain that didn't belong. Chapter 3. The Police Arrive. The sun had dipped below the sycamores, casting a soft amber glow over Ashford Manor's gardens, when the crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock. His black police car, austere against the fading gaiety of the garden party, drew murmurs from the guests still huddled under the marquee. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more in her wicker chair, her knitting a quiet rhythm in her hands, watched as Craddock stepped out, his lean frame and sharp eyes marking him as a man who missed little. He carried a notebook, its edges worn from use, and his expression was one of brisk determination, tempered by the weariness of a man accustomed to human folly. Behind him, 2 constables followed, their boots heavy on the path, their faces set in professional solemnity. The crowd parted as Craddock approached the fountain, where Reginald Holt's body still lay, now covered with a sheet from the Manor's linen closet. Dr. Haydock, lingering nearby, briefed the inspector in low tones, his gestures precise as he pointed to the spilled glass and the froth on Holt's lips. Craddock's pencil scratched notes, his brow furrowing at the mention of cyanide. He glanced at the fountain, its marble cherubs still spouting water with indifferent grace, and his lips tightened. A poison case, Miss Marple knew, was a tangle of intent and opportunity, and Craddock was no stranger to such puzzles. She had worked with him before, in St. Mary Mead, and though he valued her insights, he was not yet ready to seek them. Sir Henry Ashford, his earlier poise fraying like an old tapestry, approached Craddock with a forced calm. "Inspector, this is a tragedy, a shocking tragedy," he said, his voice carrying a tremor. "The fountain's water is from a private spring, tested regularly. I checked the pipes myself this morning. It's unthinkable that—" He stopped, his hand gesturing toward the sheet-covered form. Craddock nodded, his face neutral. "We'll need to test the water, Sir Henry, and I'll want a word with everyone who was near the fountain today." His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for protest. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her eyes flitting from face to face. Sir Henry's insistence on the fountain's purity was fervent, but she noted the way his fingers gripped his cane, the knuckles white. A man defending his pride, she thought, or perhaps something more. She recalled a case in the village, years ago, where a landowner's vehement denials had masked a guilty conscience. Not that Sir Henry was guilty, yet, but his agitation was a thread to follow. Craddock turned to the guests, raising his voice to address the murmuring crowd. "I'll need your cooperation," he said. "No one is to leave until we've taken statements. If you saw anything unusual near the fountain, come forward." His gaze swept the marquee, and Miss Marple felt the weight of it pass over her, dismissing her as a harmless old lady. She smiled faintly. Being underestimated, she had learned, was a powerful advantage. The inspector began with the footman who had served Holt's glass, a nervous lad named James, barely 20, whose hands shook as he spoke. "I filled it straight from the fountain, sir," he stammered. "Same as for the others. No one tampered with it, not that I saw." Craddock's pencil paused. And where were you standing? Could someone have approached the fountain without your notice? James flushed, his eyes darting to the ground. I stepped away for a moment, sir, to fetch more glasses, but only a moment. Craddock's expression didn't change, but Miss Marple saw the calculation in his eyes. A moment, she thought, was all a poisoner needed. Next, Craddock questioned Mrs. Eliza Morton, who stood by her buffet table, her apron now removed but her hands twisting a napkin. "My staff served bottled drinks, Inspector," she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "Lemonade, sherry, tea, nothing from the fountain. My trays were nowhere near it." Her eyes flicked to Sir Henry, then away, and Miss Marple noted the gesture. Mrs. Morton's debts to Sir Henry were a village secret, and fear of ruin could drive desperate acts. Yet her denial was too quick, her posture too rigid. Miss Marple recalled a shopkeeper in St. Mary Mead who'd sworn innocence while hiding stolen goods in her storeroom. Words, she knew, could be as deceptive as silence. Tom Baines was next, summoned from the greenhouse where he'd retreated. He stood before Craddock, his cap in his hands, his face a mask of sullen reserve. "I was tending the roses," he said, his voice low. "Didn't see the fountain afternoon. My work's in the beds, not with the guests." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You're the gardener, Mr. Baines. You must know the fountain's workings, its pipes, its access points." Baines's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I know it, but I didn't touch it today." His boots, still improbably clean, caught Miss Marple's eye again. A gardener at work, she thought, should have earth on his soles, unless he'd taken care to avoid it. Victor Crane, summoned last of the key figures, approached with the confidence of a man accustomed to boardrooms. His navy suit was immaculate, his cufflinks glinting as he adjusted them, a habit Miss Marple had noted earlier. "I was with Mr. Langley and Miss Harrow most of the afternoon," he said, naming two guests. "We discussed business near the marquee. I barely noticed the fountain." His voice was smooth, but his eyes darted to the covered body, then away. Craddock's pencil moved swiftly. "And your quarrel with Mr. Holt? I hear it was heated." Crane's smile was tight. "Business, Inspector. Nothing more. I had no reason to harm him." Miss Marple's needles paused. Crane's composure was a performance, and she had seen such performances crack under pressure. As Craddock continued his interviews, Miss Marple slipped closer to the fountain, her steps slow to avoid attention. The constables were busy cordoning off the area, and Dr. Haydock was overseeing the removal of Holt's body to the Manor's drawing room, where it would await the coroner. The fountain's water still flowed, its gentle splash a mockery of the tragedy it had wrought. Miss Marple studied the marble basin, noting the small access panel she'd glimpsed earlier. It was discreet, tucked beneath a cherub's wing, but accessible to anyone who knew where to look. She thought of a village well, poisoned years ago by a spurned suitor. The method was simple, the motive complex. Here, she suspected, the reverse might be true. She returned to her chair as Craddock conferred with a constable who reported the initial findings from the fountain's water sample. "Cyanide, sir," the constable said quietly. "Enough to kill in minutes. Must have been added during the party. Water was clean this morning, according to the staff." Craddock's frown deepened. The fountain was public, yet only Holt had died. The poison, then, was either precisely timed or selectively delivered. Miss Marple's mind turned to the footman's absence, the moment when the fountain was unguarded. Opportunity, she thought, was a narrow window, but a determined hand could slip through it. The guests' statements were maddeningly vague. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager to help, recalled seeing Holt drink from the fountain but noticed nothing odd. "He was so lively," she said, her voice trembling. "Then he just collapsed." Others mentioned Crane's proximity to the fountain, Baines's absence during the critical hour, or Mrs. Morton's staff bustling near the buffet. No one saw the act itself, but Miss Marple knew that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. People saw what they expected to see, and a clever murderer counted on that. Craddock, now pacing near the fountain, looked frustrated. "It's a devil of a case," he muttered to Dr. Haydock. "Poison in plain sight, and no one saw a thing." Miss Marple, unnoticed, tilted her head. She had heard such complaints before, from inspectors who thought mysteries were solved by facts alone. But facts, she knew, were, like her knitting, useless without the pattern that bound them. She considered the suspects anew. Sir Henry's shock seemed genuine, but his control of the fountain's maintenance made him a figure of interest. Mrs. Morton's agitation hinted at secrets, perhaps unrelated to murder, but potent enough to cloud her actions. Baines's reticence and clean boots suggested he knew more than he said, and Crane, his smooth denials and nervous gestures, marked him as a man with something to hide. As the guests were dismissed to the Manor's drawing-room to await further questioning, Miss Marple remained, her knitting a quiet anchor. The fountain gleamed in the twilight, its water catching the last rays of the sun. She thought of the village, its calm exterior hiding passions as old as time. Greed, she mused, could drive a man like Crane to eliminate a rival. Resentment could push Baines to sabotage his employer's pride. Fear of ruin might turn Mrs. Morton's capable hands to darker deeds. And Sir Henry, had he enemies he didn't see, or a motive yet to surface? Craddock glanced her way, his expression softening. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching, "you've a knack for seeing what others miss. Any thoughts?" She smiled, her eyes gentle but sharp. "Only that people are rarely what they seem, Inspector. And a fountain, like a village, holds more secrets than it shows." He nodded, half amused, half respectful, and turned back to his work. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. The truth, she knew, was in the details, the cufflink, the boot, the stain, the glance. She would watch, and she would listen, and the pattern would emerge, as it always did. Chapter 4. The Rival's Shadow. The morning after the garden party, St. Mary Mead awoke to a subdued hum, as if the village itself held its breath. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, the lace curtains filtering the soft light of an overcast sky. Her knitting lay idle on the table, a rare pause, as she sipped tea and turned her thoughts to Victor Crane. His polished demeanor at the party, marred by that nervous tick with his cufflinks, lingered in her mind like a snag in her wool. Crane, she knew, was no stranger to ambition, and ambition, when thwarted, could curdle into something dangerous. The village gossip, ever a reliable stream, had carried tales of his rivalry with Reginald Holt, the young entrepreneur whose death now cast a pall over Ashford Manor. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Rivalries, she had learned, were rarely just business. She rose, adjusting her shawl, and decided to visit Mrs. Bantry at Danemead, knowing her friend's knack for collecting the village's secrets. The walk along the high street was brisk, the air carrying a hint of autumn despite the August date. St. Mary Mead's cottages, with their tidy gardens and ivy-clad walls, seemed unchanged, yet Miss Marple sensed the unease beneath their charm. At the post office, she overheard a clerk mention Crane's recent visit to Much Benham, the nearby market town. "Something about chemicals," the clerk said, her voice low. Miss Marple filed the detail away, her mind recalling a case where a chemist's purchase had unraveled a murder. Mrs. Bantry welcomed her with a flourish, her floral dress as bright as her gossip. Over tea and scones, she leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Victor Crane, Jane is a ruthless sort," she said, spreading jam with a vigor that matched her tone. "He was livid when Holt won that railway contract. I heard from Mrs. Price at the Women's Institute that Crane stormed out of a meeting with investors, calling Holt a thief of ideas." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alert. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose jealousy over a promotion had led to a sabotaged cart. Envy, she thought, was a spark that could ignite a deadly fire. Mrs. Bantry continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And there's more. My maid Elsie saw Crane at the Red Lion last week, arguing with Holt, raised voices, fists on the table, quite the scene." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A public quarrel suggested boldness, or perhaps desperation. Crane's wealth and status made him a man who preferred control, yet Holt's success had challenged that. She thanked Mrs. Bantry, promising to return for bridge, and stepped back into the village, her thoughts on Crane's movements. At the vicarage, where she stopped to drop off a knitted blanket for the church sale, Miss Marple found another thread. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was sorting donations, her hands busy but her tongue busier. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful about poor Mr. Holt," she said, pausing to adjust her spectacles. "But I did hear something curious. My girl, Mary, mentioned Mr. Crane visiting a chemist in Much Benham 2 days before the party. She thought it odd. He mentioned pest control, but his townhouse has no garden to speak of." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Cyanide, she knew, was a common ingredient in rat poison, and a chemist's ledger could tell a story more honest than its buyer. She decided to act. With a polite excuse, she caught the bus to Much Benham, her black handbag clutched primly on her lap. The town's chemist shop, with its green awning and jars of colored powders, was quiet save for the jingle of the bell as she entered. Mr. Gibbs, the chemist, recognized her from village visits and greeted her warmly. "Just a small inquiry," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "I understand Mr. Crane made a purchase recently. Could you check your ledger?" Mr. Gibbs, sensing no harm in an old lady's curiosity, obliged. The ledger revealed a purchase of cyanide-based rat poison, signed for by Victor Crane 3 days before the garden party. "For his warehouse," he said, Mr. Gibbs noted, scratching his head. "Though I thought it queer, he's not the sort to handle pests. Himself?" Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Crane's townhouse, as Mrs. Clement had said, had no warehouse, only a manicured courtyard. The purchase suggested intent, but intent alone was not proof. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who'd bought arsenic, claiming it was for weeds, only to use it on her husband. The lie was in the detail, and Crane's warehouse excuse felt flimsy. She made a mental note to share this with Inspector Craddock, though she knew he'd need more than a ledger to act. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked past the Red Lion Inn, where a few locals lingered over pints. She paused, her eyes catching a glimpse of Crane through the window, speaking with a man in a gray suit. His gestures were animated, his cufflinks flashing as he waved a hand. The other man, whom Miss Marple recognized as Mr. Langley, an investor from the party, nodded gravely. She couldn't hear their words, but Crane's urgency was clear. Was he securing an alibi or plotting his next move? She thought of a village lad who'd covered his thefts with charm, his lies unraveling only when his accomplices spoke. Crane, she suspected, was a man who planned his steps carefully. At home, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts on Crane. His rivalry with Holt was more than professional. It was personal, a wound to his pride. The fountain, public and prominent, was an ideal stage for a man like Crane, who could strike and then fade into the crowd. Yet his nervous tick, that constant adjustment of his cufflinks, suggested a crack in his composure. She recalled a case where a murderer's fidgeting had betrayed him. A button twisted too often, a glance too quick. Crane's cufflinks, she thought, might hold more than shine. She decided to attend the evening service at the church, knowing the village would gather and tongues would loosen. There, amid the hymns and candlelight, she overheard a maid from Ashford Manor mention Crane's behavior at the party. "He was by the fountain a long time," the maid whispered to a friend. "Kept looking at Mr. Holt like he was sizing him up." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her pew. The maid's words were a thread, thin but strong, linking Crane to the scene of the crime. She would need to watch him closely to see if his shadow grew darker. As the service ended, Miss Marple stepped into the cool evening, the stars faint above the village. Crane's purchase of cyanide, his quarrel with Holt, his lingering by the fountain, all pointed to a man with motive and means. Yet she knew better than to trust the obvious. People, she had learned, were like her knitting patterns, simple at first glance, intricate when studied. Crane might be the poisoner, but the fountain's secret required more than one man's malice. She would speak to Craddock tomorrow, nudging him toward the chemist's ledger without seeming to lead. For now, she walked home. Her steps light, but her mind heavy with the weight of suspicion. The truth, she knew, was a patient quarry, and she was a patient hunter. Chapter 5. The Gardener's Grudge. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of its cottages and lending the village a dreamlike quality. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, set out for Ashford Manor, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. Her mind was on Tom Baines, the gardener whose sullen demeanor and curiously clean boots had caught her attention at the garden party. His bitterness toward Sir Henry Ashford, rooted in his brother's dismissal, was the talk of the village, and Miss Marple knew that grudges, like weeds, could choke even the most orderly garden. She carried a small basket of apples as a pretext for her visit, a gift for the manor's kitchen, but her true purpose was to observe Baines in his domain. The manor's grounds were quieter now, the festive air of the party replaced by a somber hush. The fountain, cordoned off by police tape, stood silent, its cherubs frozen in mid-spray. Miss Marple found Baines in the greenhouse, a glass-walled haven, filled with the earthy scent of soil and the vibrant hues of roses. He was pruning a thorned stem with a pair of shears, his movements precise, but his face set in a scowl. His tweed cap was pulled low, and his hands, rough from years of labor, moved with a controlled intensity. "Good morning, Mr. Baines," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as she offered the apples. I thought the kitchen might enjoy these." Baines glanced up, his dark eyes wary. "Kind of you, miss," he muttered, setting the shears down. "But I've work to do." His tone was gruff, but Miss Marple was undaunted. She had known men like him in St. Mary Mead, reserved, proud, their anger simmering beneath a stoic exterior. She commented on the roses, their petals a vivid crimson, and Baines's expression softened slightly. "They're my pride," he said, gesturing to the blooms. "More care than that fountain ever got." His voice carried a barb, and Miss Marple seized the opening. "Such a pity about the fountain," she said, her tone light but probing. "Sir Henry spoke so highly of it. Must be a trial, keeping such a thing in order." Baines's jaw tightened, and he turned back to his roses. "He cares more for that marble nonsense than his own people," he said, his words clipped. "Fired my brother, John, over a trifle. Left him to scrape by in much Benham, no reference, no prospects." The resentment in his voice was raw, and Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her mind noting the depth of his grievance. She recalled a village carpenter who'd sabotaged a rival's workbench after a similar slight. Anger, she knew, could fester into something darker. She lingered, asking about the greenhouse's upkeep, her questions innocent but calculated. Baines, warming to the topic, mentioned his routine, tending the beds, checking the irrigation, avoiding the fountain unless ordered. "Sir Henry's particular about it," he said. "Inspects the pipes himself, won't let me near them." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. If Baines was barred from the fountain's maintenance, his opportunity to tamper was limited, yet his presence at the party placed him near the scene. She noticed his boots again, still clean despite the muddy paths outside the greenhouse. "You keep your boots remarkably tidy," she remarked, her tone admiring. Baines flushed, his hands pausing. "Habit," he said shortly. "Don't like tracking dirt indoors." The explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple sensed evasion. Clean boots on a working gardener suggested caution, perhaps to avoid leaving traces. She thanked him for his time, leaving the apples on a workbench, and stepped back into the garden, her mind turning over his words. Baines's grudge was clear, but was it motive enough for murder? Poisoning the fountain would strike at Sir Henry's pride, yet Reginald Holt, not Sir Henry, had been the victim. The puzzle, she thought, was in the target. At the village tea shop, Miss Marple met Mrs. Price, a gossip with a memory for detail. Over a pot of Earl Grey, Mrs. Price leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Tom Baines has been sour since his brother left," she said. "John was a good lad, but Sir Henry caught him selling off some old tools. Harsh to sack him without a word, though." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly in her bag. The dismissal explained Baines's bitterness, but she wondered if it extended to Holt. Had the young entrepreneur, a symbol of Sir Henry's world, become a target for displaced rage? She decided to visit Baines's shed, a weathered structure tucked behind the greenhouse. With the manor staff distracted by police inquiries, she slipped inside, her movements as unobtrusive as a shadow. The shed was orderly, with tools hung neatly and bags of fertilizer stacked in a corner. But what struck her was the absence of gardening chemicals. No pesticides, no weed killers, nothing that might contain cyanide. For a gardener of Baines's caliber, this was unusual. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a missing bottle of rat poison had pointed to the culprit. Had Baines disposed of evidence, or was his shed always so sparse? As she left the shed, she spotted Baines watching from the greenhouse door, his expression unreadable. She smiled, unfazed, and commented on the fine weather, but his nod was curt. His wariness, she thought, was telling. A man with nothing to hide would not guard his space so closely. She made her way back to the village, stopping at the post office to telephone Inspector Craddock. "Just a small observation," she said, her voice mild. "You might ask Mr. Baines about his shed. It's rather empty for a gardener's." Craddock, accustomed to her cryptic hints, promised to look into it. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her cottage fire, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts on Baines. His grudge against Sir Henry was potent, but his clean boots and empty shed suggested calculation, not impulse. Had he seen something at the party, perhaps Victor Crane near the fountain, and kept silent out of spite? Or had he played a darker role? She thought of a village boy who'd tampered with a neighbor's gate to settle a score, his actions small but deliberate. Baines, she suspected, was not the poisoner, but his silence might hold a key. The village clock chimed 9, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Baines's grudge was a thread in the tapestry, but it was tangled with others: Crane's ambition, Mrs. Morton's debts, Sir Henry's secrets. The fountain, she mused, was a stage where motives converged, and Baines, whether actor or witness, knew more than he said. She would watch him as she watched them all, her quiet presence a net for the truth. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak to Mrs. Morton. The caterer's strained smile and stained apron were threads yet to be unraveled, and Miss Marple was never one to leave a stitch undone. Chapter 6. The Caterer's Secret. The morning sun broke through the mist, casting a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead's High Street, where the village stirred with its usual rhythm: milk bottles clinking, a bicycle bell ringing, the faint hum of gossip at the bakery. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, walked purposefully toward Mrs. Eliza Morton's catering shop, its signboard proclaiming "Morton's Fine Foods" in elegant script. The events of the garden party, now 2 days past, hung over the village like a persistent fog, and Mrs. Morton's flushed face and stained apron at the party lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Debts, she knew, could weigh heavier than conscience, and a woman in financial straits might act in ways she'd never dream otherwise. Her visit, ostensibly to order scones for the church sale, was a pretext to probe deeper. The shop was a haven of warmth and aroma, with trays of freshly baked tarts and cakes lining the counter. Mrs. Morton, her dark hair pinned tightly, greeted Miss Marple with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure," she said, wiping her hands on a clean apron. "Fresh," Miss Marple noted, unlike the one at the party. "Scones for the church, you say? I'll have them ready by tomorrow." Her voice was brisk, but her fingers fidgeted with a cloth, betraying a nervous edge. Miss Marple, her expression as mild as ever, complimented the shop's display, her eyes scanning the shelves. There, behind a jar of preserves, was a bottle of cleaning fluid, its label warning of cyanide compounds. "For stubborn stains," Mrs. Morton said quickly, following Miss Marple's gaze. "The kitchen gets dreadful with grease." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. Cyanide in a cleaning fluid was not unusual, but its presence in a shop, tied to a poisoning, was a thread worth pulling. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead cook, who'd hidden her misdeeds behind a bustling kitchen, her cheerful demeanor a mask for malice. Mrs. Morton's debts to Sir Henry Ashford were no secret. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned a sum large enough to threaten the shop's survival. Had Sir Henry's pressure pushed her to desperation? Miss Marple ordered a dozen scones, her tone light, and asked casually about the garden party. "Such a tragedy," she said. "You must have been run off your feet managing all those trays." Mrs. Morton's smile faltered. "It was hectic," she admitted, rearranging a tray of biscuits. "My staff were everywhere, but we kept to bottled drinks, sherry, lemonade, nothing from that fountain." Her insistence echoed her statement to Inspector Craddock, but Miss Marple noted the strain in her voice, the way her eyes avoided contact. "You were near the fountain, though," Miss Marple said gently, as if remarking on the weather. "Refilling trays, I believe?" Mrs. Morton's hands stilled. "Only for a moment," she said, her voice sharp. "I had no business with the water." The denial, Miss Marple thought, was too quick, like a door slammed shut. Leaving the shop, Miss Marple walked to the village green, where she sat on a bench to consider her findings. Mrs. Morton's apron at the party had borne a stain, not quite like food, chemical perhaps, or a trace of something she'd handled in haste. The cleaning fluid suggested a source for cyanide, but access alone was not enough. Mrs. Morton's staff, moving freely among the guests, could have slipped near the fountain unnoticed. Yet why target Reginald Holt, a man with no apparent connection to her debts? Miss Marple thought of a village seamstress who'd acted out of fear, her actions misdirected but devastating. Fear, she mused, could twist motives into unexpected shapes. At the Women's Institute meeting that afternoon, Miss Marple listened as the village matrons dissected the tragedy. Mrs. Price, ever a font of rumor, leaned close. "Eliza Morton's in deep with Sir Henry," she whispered. "He lent her money for the shop, but he's been pressing for repayment. Threatened to call in the debt, I hear." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. A threat of ruin could drive a woman to extremes, but poisoning a guest seemed a curious revenge. Unless, she thought, Holt's death served another purpose, perhaps to distract or discredit Sir Henry. She made a mental note to ask Craddock about Mrs. Morton's staff, particularly any who'd been near the fountain. Later, Miss Marple visited the manor's kitchen under the guise of thanking the staff for their efforts at the party. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Gibbs, was peeling potatoes and eager to talk. Mrs. Morton's lot were in and out, she said, her knife flashing. One of her girls, young Lily, was fetching trays from the buffet right by the fountain. Looked flustered, she did. When Mr. Holt fell, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A flustered girl might be nervous from guilt or simply from the chaos of the moment. She thanked Mrs. Gibbs and left, her mind on Lily. A young assistant, easily overlooked, could move through a crowd without suspicion. That evening, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice as unassuming as ever. "You might look into Mrs. Morton's staff, Inspector," she suggested, "particularly a girl named Lily. She was near the fountain, I understand." Craddock, accustomed to her gentle nudges, thanked her, though his tone held a hint of skepticism. Miss Marple smiled as she hung up. Skepticism, she knew, would yield to evidence, and she had a knack for pointing the way. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a quiet companion. Mrs. Morton's secret, she sensed, was not murder, but fear. Fear of losing her shop, her reputation, her place in the village. The stained apron, the cleaning fluid, the flustered assistant. All were threads, but they didn't yet form a pattern. Had Mrs. Morton acted to protect herself, or was she, like Baines, a witness to something she dared not name. Miss Marple thought of Victor Crane, his cufflinks and his cyanide purchase, and wondered if Mrs. Morton had seen him near the fountain. The caterer's secret, she suspected, was in what she withheld, not what she'd done. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. The fountain's mystery was a tapestry of motives: Crane's ambition, Baines's grudge, Mrs. Morton's fear, and perhaps Sir Henry's own unseen enemies. She would need to unravel more threads to see where they led. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak to Sir Henry himself. His shock at the party had seemed genuine, but men of wealth often hid their truths behind a mask of charm. The truth, she knew, was patient, and she was its patient keeper. Chapter 7. The Host's Burden. The third day after the garden party brought a chill to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself mourned the shadow cast by Reginald Holt's death. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, made her way to Ashford Manor, her steps measured but purposeful. The invitation to tea from Sir Henry Ashford, delivered by a somber footman, had been unexpected but welcome. She sensed in it not just courtesy, but a need to speak, perhaps to unburden himself. Sir Henry, the genial host whose fountain had become a murder weapon, was a puzzle in himself, a man of wealth and influence, yet vulnerable to the whispers of malice. Miss Marple's keen eyes, hidden behind her gentle smile, were ready to see what he might reveal. The manor's drawing-room was a study in opulence, with velvet drapes and polished mahogany reflecting the flicker of a fire. Sir Henry greeted her with a strained smile, his cream suit replaced by a somber gray one, his silver hair less orderly than at the party. "Miss Marple, you're kind to come," he said, gesturing to a plush armchair. A maid set out a silver tea service, the clink of china loud in the quiet room. "This business with Holt, it's shaken me, I confess. I can't fathom how such a thing happened under my roof." His voice trembled, and his hands, pouring tea, betrayed a slight shake. Miss Marple accepted a cup, her expression sympathetic, but her mind alert. She had known men like Sir Henry, proud yet fragile when their world was tested. She sipped her tea, noting the fine Darjeeling, and remarked on the manor's beauty. "Such a splendid setting for your fountain," she said, her tone light. "It must be a great responsibility maintaining it." Sir Henry's face tightened, his fingers gripping the teapot. "It was my pride," he said. "I checked the pipes myself that morning, clean as a whistle, from a private spring. I told the inspector as much. Someone must have tampered with it during the party, but who? And why Holt?" His voice rose, then fell, as if he feared his own question. Miss Marple's needles, resting in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. Sir Henry's insistence on the fountain's purity was consistent, but its fervor suggested more than pride. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the shock of a man whose hospitality had been violated? She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, Squire, who'd protested his innocence too loudly, only to be undone by a misplaced letter. Sir Henry, she thought, might be hiding nothing, or everything. "You knew Mr. Holt well?" she asked, her voice soft as the fire's crackle. Sir Henry hesitated, his eyes on the flames. "Not well, RPC.0 well," he said. "A bright young man, full of ideas. He dined here a few times, talking of his railway designs. I admired him, though we weren't close." His gaze flickered to the window, where the fountain stood silent. "I can't imagine why anyone would target him." Miss Marple nodded, noting the pause before his answer. A man of his stature, she knew, often knew more than he shared, whether by design or habit. She steered the conversation to the party, her questions gentle but probing. "It was a lively gathering," she said. "So many people near the fountain. Mr. Crane, I noticed, seemed quite taken with it." Sir Henry's face darkened. "Crane's a snake," he said sharply. "Ambitious, ruthless. He lost a contract to Holt, didn't take it well. But murder? I wouldn't have thought him capable." His tone held a trace of doubt, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Doubt, she knew, often masked suspicion. She mentioned Tom Baines watching Sir Henry's reaction. "The gardener seems devoted to your roses," she said. Sir Henry sighed. "Baines is a good man, but bitter. His brother's dismissal hit him hard. I had no choice. John was stealing. Baines never forgave me." His voice was heavy, and Miss Marple saw genuine regret. A man burdened by his decisions, she thought, but not necessarily a murderer. Yet his control over the fountain's maintenance made him a figure of interest. Had he overlooked a flaw, or was he deflecting blame? Mrs. Morton's name brought a different response. "Eliza's in a bad way," Sir Henry said, his brow furrowing. "I lent her money for her shop, more than I should have, perhaps. She's struggling to repay it. I've been patient, but—" He trailed off, his fingers drumming on the armrest. Miss Marple's mind turned to the caterer's stained apron, her nervous demeanor. A woman pressed by debt might act rashly, but against Holt? The motive remained elusive. As tea ended, Sir Henry escorted her to the door, his manner distracted. "I want justice for Holt," he said, his voice low. "This house will never be the same." Miss Marple thanked him, her eyes lingering on his trembling hand. His burden, she sensed, was not just grief, but fear. Of scandal, of betrayal, perhaps of truth. She recalled a village doctor who'd hidden a mistake behind charm, his downfall a single careless word. Sir Henry's charm was fraying, and she wondered what lay beneath. Walking home through the village, Miss Marple passed the fountain, still cordoned off. Its marble gleamed dully in the gray light, a silent witness to the crime. Sir Henry's insistence on its purity nagged at her. If he was innocent, his oversight had allowed a poisoner to strike. If guilty, his shock was a masterful act. She thought of Victor Crane's cyanide purchase, Baines's clean boots, Mrs. Morton's stained apron. Sir Henry's burden tied them together. But how? She would speak to Craddock tomorrow, nudging him toward the manor's pipes. For now, she returned to her cottage, her knitting waiting like an old friend. The truth, she knew, was a knot to be untied, and she held the thread. Chapter 8. The Chemist's Clue. The fourth morning after the garden party dawned crisp in St. Mary Mead, the village waking to a sky streaked with clouds that promised rain. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag slung over her arm, boarded the early bus to Much Benham, her mind fixed on the chemist's ledger and Victor Crane's purchase of cyanide-based rat poison. The village whispers, gathered like loose threads at the Women's Institute and the post office, pointed to Crane's visit to the chemist as more than a coincidence. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing patterns in human behavior, knew that a man like Crane, polished, ambitious, and nursing a grudge, might weave a lie as smoothly as she knitted a scarf. Her visit to the chemist under the guise of buying lavender salts was a step toward unraveling his story. The bus rattled along the country lanes, passing fields dotted with sheep and hedgerows heavy with late summer berries. Miss Marple's thoughts were on the fountain, its marble cherubs now a grim symbol of death. Crane's nervous cufflink adjustments at the party, his proximity to the fountain, and his rivalry with Reginald Holt formed a pattern, but it needed evidence to hold. The chemist's ledger, she hoped, would provide a stitch to secure it. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, grocer, who'd bought arsenic for rats, only to poison a rival's tea. Purchases, she knew, could betray intent when words did not. Much Benham's High Street was bustling, its market stalls laden with vegetables and bolts of cloth. The chemist's shop, with its green awning and faint scent of camphor, stood quiet at the corner. Mr. Gibbs, the chemist, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted Miss Marple with a nod. "Lavender salts, you say?" he asked, reaching for a jar. Miss Marple smiled, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "And while you're at it, Mr. Gibbs, might I trouble you to check your ledger? I heard Mr. Crane made a purchase recently, something about pest control. A friend was curious." Her vagueness was deliberate, a tactic honed over years of village inquiries. Mr. Gibbs, sensing no harm in an old lady's request, flipped open his ledger. His finger traced the entries, stopping at one dated 3 days before the garden party. "Here it is," he said. "Victor Crane, cyanide-based rat poison, signed for on the 8th. Said it was for his warehouse. Odd, though. I've never known him to deal with pests himself." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her mild expression. A warehouse, she thought, was a convenient fiction for a man with no such property. She thanked Mr. Gibbs, purchased her salts, and stepped back into the street, her mind stitching the clue into place. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock from the post office, her voice calm but precise. "Inspector, you might look into Mr. Crane's purchase at the Much Benham chemist," she said. "Cyanide, for a warehouse he doesn't own. It's curious, don't you think?" Craddock, his tone a mix of respect and exasperation, promised to follow up. Miss Marple hung up, knowing he'd act, though he'd never admit her nudge was the spark. She had guided him before, in cases where the obvious hid the truth, and she trusted his diligence to match her insight. Craddock, true to his word, visited Crane that afternoon at his rented townhouse on the edge of the village. Miss Marple, informed later by a chatty constable at the tea shop, learned that Crane had been smooth but evasive. "The poison's at my office in London," he'd claimed, producing a vague receipt. Craddock, skeptical, ordered a search of Crane's car, parked discreetly behind the Red Lion Inn. Miss Marple, passing by on her way home, paused as the constable emerged, holding a small vial, empty but with a faint almond-like smell. "Cyanide residue," the constable muttered to his colleague, unaware of Miss Marple's quiet presence. Her lips pursed. An empty vial was no confession, but it was a thread pulled tight. Crane, when confronted with the vial, blustered. "It's from my office," he insisted, his cufflinks glinting as he waved a hand. "I must have left it in the car." But his voice, the constable noted, lacked conviction, and his eyes darted to the door. Miss Marple, hearing this, recalled a village merchant who'd hidden stolen goods in his cart, his denials crumbling under scrutiny. Crane's composure, she thought, was a façade, and the vial was a crack in its surface. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting a steady rhythm as she considered the chemist's clue. Crane's purchase, his lie about the warehouse, and the vial in his car pointed to guilt, but the fountain's public nature complicated the pattern. Poisoning a shared water source risked others, Yet only Holt had died. She thought of a case where a poisoned cake had been meant for one, but nearly killed three. Precision, she knew, required opportunity, and Crane's lingering by the fountain suggested he'd found it. Yet she wondered about the others. Baines's clean boots, Mrs. Morton's stained apron, Sir Henry's fervent denials. Were they threads in Crane's tapestry, or part of another? As the village clock chimed 10, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. The chemist's clue was a cornerstone, but the fountain held more secrets. She would visit the manor tomorrow to study its pipes and panels. Crane's shadow loomed large, but she knew better than to trust a single thread. People, she mused, were like her knitting, complex, tangled, and full of surprises. The truth was close, and she would find it, one stitch at a time. Chapter 9. The Fountain's Secret. The 5th day since the garden party brought a steady drizzle to St. Mary Mead, veiling the village in a soft gray curtain. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, donned her raincoat and sturdy hat, her black handbag clutched firmly as she made her way to Ashford Manor. The fountain, now a silent monument to Reginald Holt's death, drew her like a magnet. Its marble cherubs, glistening in the rain, held secrets she was determined to uncover. Victor Crane's cyanide purchase and the vial in his car had tightened the net around him, but Miss Marple knew that a murder so public required more than motive. It demanded precision. The fountain's design, she suspected, was the key to how the poison was delivered. The manor's grounds were deserted, save for a constable stationed near the cordoned-off fountain, his collar turned up against the damp. Miss Marple, with the disarming smile of an elderly aunt, approached him. "Such a shame about the garden," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of concern. "Might I take a closer look at the fountain? I'm curious about its craftsmanship." The constable, seeing no harm in an old lady's interest, nodded and lifted the tape, allowing her to approach. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the marble structure. The basin was wide and shallow, its water still, the pump silenced since the tragedy. The cherubs, frozen in their playful arcs, seemed to mock the grim scene. She circled the fountain, noting the small access panel she'd glimpsed at the party, tucked beneath a cherub's wing. It was discreet, flush with the marble, but not locked, a detail that struck her as significant. She recalled a village fete where a tampered water tank had gone unnoticed until a child fell ill. The simplicity of such sabotage was its strength, she thought. Anyone with a moment's opportunity could have opened the panel and slipped cyanide into the pipes. She glanced at the constable, busy adjusting his hat, and decided to press further. Returning to the manor, she sought out Tom Baines, who was raking leaves near the greenhouse, his tweed cap damp with rain. "Mr. Baines," she called, her tone as warm as the weather was not. "Might you help an old lady with a question about the fountain? Its pipes are quite intricate, I hear." Baines, his face as dour as ever, leaned on his rake. "Aye, they're complex," he said, his voice grudging. "But Sir Henry keeps me from them, says it's his to maintain." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Could you open that little panel for me? I'd love to see the workmanship." Baines hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but her guileless expression disarmed him. He trudged to the fountain, his clean boots splashing lightly in the puddles, and knelt to pry open the panel with a pocket knife. Inside, a narrow pipe gleamed, its surface clean, but for a faint powdery residue along its edge. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "How curious," she said, as if admiring a flower. "Is that dust, do you think?" Baines shrugged, his discomfort plain. "Could be," he muttered, closing the panel quickly. Miss Marple thanked him, noting his haste. A man who knew more than he said, she thought, or one who feared what he'd seen. She telephoned Inspector Craddock from the Manor's hall, her voice soft but urgent. "Inspector, you might examine the fountain's access panel," she suggested. "There's a residue inside. Worth testing, I think." Craddock, his tone betraying a mix of gratitude and curiosity, promised to send a constable with a sample kit. Miss Marple returned to the village, her umbrella shielding her from the rain, but not from her racing thoughts. The residue, she suspected, was cyanide, and its placement inside the panel suggested a deliberate act, not a casual spill. The fountain's design allowed for such precision, open to all, yet private in its hidden workings. At the tea shop, she overheard a maid from the manor mention Crane's behavior at the party. "He was by that fountain a good while," the maid said to a friend, her voice low. "Fiddling with his cuffs, standing right where that panel is." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her bag, seemed to click in agreement. Crane's nervous tick, his proximity to the panel, and the vial in his car formed a pattern, but she cautioned herself against haste. A case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned jam jar had nearly misled her, taught her that evidence could point too neatly to one suspect. She recalled the party's chaos, the guests milling, the quartet playing, the footman stepping away. Crane, standing by the fountain, could have opened the panel in seconds, dropping cyanide into the pipe. The water, flowing freely, would carry the poison to the basin where Holt's glass was filled. Yet the risk, others drinking from the same source, nagged at her. She thought of a village baker who'd tainted a single loaf, knowing his target's habits. Crane, she reasoned, must have watched Holt closely, timing his act for the moment Holt drank. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a quiet companion. The fountain's secret was its accessibility, a panel anyone could open, a pipe anyone could taint. Crane's shadow loomed large, but Baines's hesitation at the panel troubled her. Had he seen Crane's act and stayed silent, his grudge against Sir Henry outweighing his duty? Or was there another hand at work? Mrs. Morton's stained apron, Sir Henry's fervent denials. Each was a thread yet to be woven into the pattern. She would need to speak to Baines again, to tease out what he knew. For now, she trusted Craddock to test the residue, knowing it would tighten the case against Crane, or reveal a new twist. As the rain pattered against her window, Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. The fountain, she mused, was a mirror of human nature, beautiful, open, yet hiding a deadly truth. The pattern was emerging, stitch by stitch, and she would follow it to the end. Chapter 10. The Gardener's Confession. The 6th day following the tragedy at Ashford Manor found St. Mary Mead cloaked in a quiet unease, as if the village sensed the threads of the mystery drawing tighter. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, sat in her cottage parlor, the fire casting a warm glow on her knitting, which lay momentarily idle. The residue in the fountain's access panel, confirmed by Inspector Craddock as cyanide, had sharpened the case against Victor Crane, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Tom Baines. His hesitation when opening the panel, his clean boots, and his sullen grudge against Sir Henry suggested he held a piece of the puzzle. She resolved to invite him for tea, knowing that a gardener, like any man, might reveal more in the comfort of a quiet chat than under police scrutiny. She sent a note to Baines via the Manor's kitchen maid, requesting his assistance with her own modest garden, a pretext as old as her knitting, but effective. By mid-afternoon, Baines arrived, his tweed cap in hand, his expression a mix of wariness and resignation. "You've a fine rosebush, Mr. Baines," Miss Marple said, pouring tea from a chipped but cherished teapot. "I thought you might advise me on mine." The compliment softened his guard, and he nodded, accepting a cup. The cottage, with its lace curtains and scent of lavender, seemed to ease his tension, and Miss Marple, with her gentle questions, steered the conversation to the manor. "The fountain must be a burden to maintain," she said, her tone as light as the steam rising from her cup. "All those pipes and panels, you must see a great deal, working so close." Baines's fingers tightened on his saucer, his eyes fixed on the table. "I keep to the beds," he said gruffly. "Sir Henry's particular about that fountain, won't let me near it." His voice held the same bitterness. She ascendant, Miss Marple recalled a village girl who'd poisoned a rival's milk jug, her silence protecting her until the truth emerged. Baines's silence, she sensed, was not guilt, but knowledge. She pressed gently, offering a scone. "It was such a busy day at the party," she said. "So many people near the fountain. I noticed Mr. Crane lingering there. Rather long, don't you think?" Baines's face darkened, and he set his cup down with a clink. "Aye," he muttered. "I saw him, standing by that panel, fiddling with his cuffs. Looked shifty, but I didn't think much of it till after." His words came slowly, as if dragged from a deep well. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "You didn't mention this to the inspector?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Baines shifted, his clean boots scraping the floor. "Didn't want trouble," he said. "Sir Henry's done enough to my family. Thought if his precious fountain brought him grief, it was no skin off my nose." His tone was defiant, but his eyes betrayed unease. Miss Marple nodded, her needles still in her mind. She thought of a saint. Mary Mead lad who'd seen a theft but stayed silent out of spite, only to regret it when the thief struck again. Baines's grudge had kept him quiet, but his confession now was a thread pulled loose. She offered more tea, her manner calm. "You were wise to tell me," she said. "The truth has a way of surfacing, like a weed in a garden." Baines grunted, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He admitted he'd avoided the muddy paths near the fountain that day, keeping his boots clean to avoid notice. "Didn't want to be mixed up in it," he said, "but I saw Crane, clear as day, by that panel." Miss Marple's mind stitched the detail into place. Baines's silence had protected Crane, but his words now wove a tighter net. After he left, Miss Marple telephoned Craddock, her voice as mild as ever. "Mr. Baines saw Mr. Crane near the fountain's panel during the party," she said. "He's a reliable sort, Inspector. You might ask him directly." Craddock, his tone warm with gratitude, promised to follow up. Miss Marple knew he'd press Baines gently, drawing out the story without her shadow over it. She returned to her knitting, the fire crackling softly. Baines's confession confirmed Crane's opportunity, matching the cyanide vial and the chemist's ledger. Yet she wondered if another hand had guided the poison's path. Mrs. Morton's stained apron, Sir Henry's fervent denials. The pattern was clearer, but not complete. That evening, Craddock visited Crane's townhouse, armed with Baines's testimony, and the vial's residue. Crane, his composure fraying like worn thread, faltered under questioning. "I was only admiring the fountain," he claimed, but his cufflinks twitched in his hands. Faced with the vial, the ledger, and Baines's account, he broke. "It was Holt," he confessed, his voice low. "He stole my contract, my future. The fountain was perfect, public, chaotic. No one would suspect me." Miss Marple, informed later by Craddock, nodded to herself. Greed, she thought, was a predictable stitch, as old as her village. As the rain began again, tapping her cottage windows, Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. Baines's confession had been the key, unlocking Crane's guilt. The fountain's secret was simple. A panel opened, a poison slipped in. But human nature, she knew, was never simple. She would visit Mrs. Morton tomorrow to tie up the loose threads of her fear. For now, the case was nearly knit, and Miss Marple's quiet presence had shaped its pattern. Chapter 11. The Caterer's Redemption. The 7th day after the garden party brought a fragile calm to St. Mary Mead, as if the village exhaled after Victor Crane's confession. The rain had ceased, leaving the air fresh and the cobblestones gleaming under a tentative sun. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked into her basket, walked to Mrs. Eliza Morton's catering shop, her mind on the caterer's strained smile and stained apron at the party. Crane's guilt was clear, but Mrs. Morton's fear, tied to her debts and her nervous demeanor, remained a loose thread. Miss Marple, ever thorough, knew that even a solved case could unravel if every stitch was not secured. Her visit, under the pretense of collecting scones for the church sale, was a chance to untangle the caterer's secret. The shop was busy, its bell jingling as customers collected orders for afternoon teas. Mrs. Morton, her dark hair pinned neatly, greeted Miss Marple with a warmth that seemed forced, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Your scones are ready, Miss Marple," she said, bustling to the counter with a wrapped parcel. "I hope they suit." Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the stained apron, replaced by a crisp new one. She thanked Mrs. Morton, then lingered, commenting on the shop's charm. "You've built something lovely here," she said, her voice gentle. "It must be a great weight, keeping it afloat." Mrs. Morton's smile wavered, and she busied herself with a tray of tarts. "It's been trying," she admitted, her voice low. "The shop's my life, but debts pile up." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, dressmaker who'd hidden her financial woes behind a cheerful façade, only to collapse when the truth emerged. "Sir Henry's been kind, I hear," she said, her tone casual, "though I understand he's pressed you lately." Mrs. Morton's hands stilled, and her eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of fear passing through them. "He's been patient," Mrs. Morton said, her words measured. "But he warned me last month. If I couldn't pay soon, he'd call in the loan. I thought—" She stopped, her voice catching. Miss Marple leaned forward, her presence as soothing as a warm hearth. "You thought he might ruin you," she prompted gently. Mrs. Morton nodded, tears welling. "I was terrified, Miss Marple. The shop, my reputation, it's all I have. When Mr. Holt died, I feared they'd blame me, with my staff so close to the fountain." Miss Marple's mind turned to the party, to Mrs. Morton's flustered assistant, Lily, near the buffet. "Your girl, Lily, seemed upset that day," she said. Mrs. Morton sighed. "She's young, nervous, dropped a tray when Mr. Holt fell. Pure shock, nothing more." Miss Marple nodded, recalling the stained apron. "And that stain on your apron?" she asked, her voice soft as a whisper. Mrs. Morton flushed. "Cleaning fluid," she said quickly. "I spilled some that morning, trying to scrub a stubborn mark. It's cyanide-based, I know, but I'd never—" Her voice broke, and she looked away, her hands twisting the cloth. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but reassuring. "No one believes you'd harm anyone," she said. "But fear can make us see shadows where there are none." She thought of a village widow who'd feared ruin and hidden evidence, only to be cleared by a single truth. Mrs. Morton's fear, she realized, was not of guilt, but of suspicion. The cleaning fluid, the debts, the proximity to the fountain had made her a suspect in her own mind, amplifying her panic. Later that day, Miss Marple learned from Mrs. Bantry, over tea at the vicarage, that Sir Henry had visited Mrs. Morton's shop. He offered her a loan extension, Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes wide. "Quite generous, after all this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sir Henry, chastened by the tragedy, was mending bridges, perhaps to salve his own conscience. Mrs. Morton, she sensed, would recover, her shop saved not by deceit, but by honesty. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, confirming that Mrs. Morton's staff had been cleared. "Lily's nerves were just that," she said, "and the stain was cleaning fluid, nothing more." Craddock, grateful for her clarity, noted that the case rested firmly on Crane. Miss Marple hung up, her mind at ease. Mrs. Morton's redemption was not just her innocence, but her courage to face her fears. The fountain's tragedy had exposed her vulnerability, but it had also freed her to rebuild. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The case was nearly complete, with Crane's confession and Baines's testimony forming the pattern's core. Mrs. Morton's thread, once tangled, was now smooth, and Sir Henry's burden lighter. The village, she thought, would heal, as it always did. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead's scandal resolved when truth replaced fear. "Honesty," she murmured, her needles clicking. "Mends most wounds." The fountain's secret was laid bare, and Miss Marple's quiet work was done. For now. Chapter 12. The village restored. The 8th day after the garden party dawned bright in St. Mary Mead, the sun casting long rays over the village's thatched roofs and tidy gardens, as if to sweep away the lingering shadow of Reginald Holt's death. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pale blue wool forming a neat scarf in her lap. The case of the poisoned fountain had unraveled, with Victor Crane's confession securing his guilt. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the village itself, its quiet rhythms, its hidden currents, its ability to mend after even the darkest deeds. She glanced at the invitation to the garden party, now tucked into her basket like a relic, its elegant script a reminder of how beauty could mask malice. The village buzzed with subdued relief, the news of Crane's arrest spreading like ripples in a pond. At the post office, Miss Marple overheard the clerk recounting Crane's downfall to a customer, her voice tinged with awe. "Caught by his own cufflinks, they say," she whispered, as if the gesture itself had betrayed him. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles steady. It was not the cufflinks, she knew, but the small truths, Baines's confession, the chemist's ledger, the residue in the fountain's panel, that had woven the net. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead theft, solved by a single dropped handkerchief. The smallest threads, she thought, often held the tightest knots. She walked to the church that morning, her lavender dress catching the breeze, to deliver the scarf for the charity sale. The vicar, polishing the brass lectern, greeted her warmly. "The village is settling, Miss Marple," he said. "Thanks to you, I hear." She shook her head, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, I only listen, vicar. People tell their own stories, if you let them." Her modesty was genuine, but her mind traced the case's pattern. Crane's greed, Baines's silence, Mrs. Morton's fear, Sir Henry's burden. Each had played a part, and the fountain had been their stage. At Ashford Manor, the fountain stood cleansed and sealed, its pipes flushed and its cherubs silent. Sir Henry, Miss Marple learned from Mrs. Bantry, had ordered it dismantled, unable to bear its tainted legacy. "He's a changed man," Mrs. Bantry said over tea, her voice softer than usual. "Says he'll fund a scholarship in Holt's name." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on Sir Henry's trembling hands at their tea. Guilt, she knew, could spur kindness as surely as fear could spur crime. She recalled a village squire who'd rebuilt a school after a scandal, seeking redemption in generosity. Mrs. Morton's shop, she passed on her way home, was bustling again, its windows bright with fresh pastries. Mrs. Morton, her apron pristine, waved to Miss Marple, her smile no longer strained. The loan extension from Sir Henry had given her breathing room, and her honesty, Miss Marple thought, had saved her more than money. She remembered a saint, Mary Mead Baker, who'd faced ruin but won trust by confessing her debts. Truth, Miss Marple mused, was a balm for the village's wounds. Tom Baines, too, had returned to his roses, his sullen air softened by his confession. At the manor's gate, Miss Marple saw him pruning, his boots now properly muddied, his cap tipped back. He nodded to her, a rare gesture of respect. His silence, born of spite, had nearly shielded a killer, but his words had set the truth free. She thought of a village lad who'd hidden a theft, only to redeem himself by speaking out. Baines, she sensed, would tend his garden with less bitterness now. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting a quiet rhythm. The invitation, still in her basket, caught her eye, and she touched its edge, her mind on the party's glittering surface and its dark undercurrents. St. Mary Mead, like all villages, was a tapestry of human nature. Envy, pride, fear, but also resilience. Crane's ambition had undone him, as ambition often did, but the village would endure, its stitches mended by time and truth. She recalled a case from years ago, where a poisoned well had nearly torn the village apart, yet it had healed through shared effort. So it would be here. Sir Henry would rebuild his reputation, Mrs. Morton her business, Baines his peace. The fountain, once a symbol of pride, was now a lesson in humility. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, each stitch a testament to her quiet work. There would always be another mystery, another tangle to unravel, and she would be ready, her eyes sharp, her heart steady, her village her guide.